it's almost impossible to overestimate the importance of pregnancy in the first, particularly the first 2 or 3 years of life. It's the time when, in a way, the foundations of the human being, the foundations of the brain and neurochemical hormonal system and our whole ways of being are developing. It's the time when we're developing our expectations of the world, so psychological development, but also brain development. The last trimester of pregnancy in particularly the first couple of years, are hugely important in terms of the development of the architecture of the brain. And we're an extraordinarily adaptive species, so we will adapt to whatever environment we happen to be born into, and our brains and bodies will then keep those adaptations with us throughout our lifespan, in a way. So part of the brilliance of the human species is that we can adapt to all kinds of different environments, whether it's in the Sahara Desert or in Iceland. And similarly, we can adapt to different kinds of emotional environments, but these templates get written down very early on. Our brain architecture is growing. We're born with as many neurons as we're ever going to have, but the connections between them, the synaptic connections, are being put in place in response to the very specific experiences we have. So, for example, if you have a loving environment, then you'll develop expectations of being loved, thought about, understood. Our whole beings will develop in response to those expectations. We'll be more likely to develop receptors for neurochemicals like oxytocin, which give rise to feelings of calm, lovability, love, care. We're more likely to develop, similarly, receptors for neurochemicals like serotonin, which makes us feel good. If we're in a stressed environment, and this includes the prenatal environment, in fact, particularly maybe the prenatal environment, then we get programmed for a different kind of life. So, for example, mothers who are highly anxious, this isn't just your average bit of stress that we all have, but highly anxious or highly depressed during pregnancy, are likely to release high levels of neurochemical hormones like cortisol, the stress hormone, for example, and these can cross the placenta and affect the developing fetus quite dramatically, so that the baby is already born programmed to be more stress reactive. And this makes good evolutionary sense, because that kind of baby is more likely to survive in an environment which is more likely to be stress-inducing postnatally if the mother's stressed prenatally. And it's never just about the mother, because the mother is never, as Winnicott said, there's no such thing as a baby. So a stressed mother might be stressed because of poverty, because of being a bad relationship, because of living in a scary neighbourhood. So it's never about mother blaming, but we have to support the mothers and the context always around the child. And so what we know is that even the fetus, if you give the fetus a stressor and the mother's very anxious, the fetus then will jump much more in utero and will be slower to calm down. So already there's a kind of preconception, there's an expectation that you have to be a bit more vigilant. And this is what we see in insecurely attached children. And what happens, what in effect is happening is the whole autonomic nervous system is being programmed in response to a current environment, which then gives rise to an expectation of the future environment. So in extreme circumstances, we'll see very dramatic changes in the autonomic nervous system in the first couple of years of life. So we see high levels of sympathetic arousal, high levels of stress, fight, flight type of responses. The fight response doesn't come in until 2 or 3 years old, but we'll also see particular kinds of brain development, so much less capacity for development of prefrontal parts of the brain, which are central to emotional regulation, to empathy, to executive functions later on. That comes with security and calm and safeness, and they don't develop in the same way in stress or trauma or violence, for example, because it would make no sense to be very calm in the face of violence. So it makes sense to be vigilant and jumpy, but the end result is you've got a child who's had the first 2 or 3 years in which their whole bodies and brains have developed in response to these rather scary environments, and that's their expectation of the world. So they're less trusting, they're less able to relax, they're less able to concentrate in school, for example, they're less able to make good relationships, because they haven't learned that these things are valuable, and they haven't learned how to do these things. One of the very dramatic things, some of the very dramatic research findings that have come out in the last few years, is that if you have adverse early childhood experiences, and some of the research has listed some of these adverse experiences, And they might be things like having a parent in prison, or an alcohol or drug using parent, or being subjected to some abuse. Then it massively predicts the likelihood of all kinds of really poor outcomes later on in life. So for example, experience of child maltreatment will give rise to smaller hippocampus, which is central to memory in adulthood. It will give rise to less linkages between the left and right hemispheres in the brain. It will give rise to much more activation in subcortical parts of the brain involved in fear, stress reactivity. But also it's hugely predictive of all kinds of psychiatric and physiological issues later on in life. So if you've had at least four adverse childhood experiences, you're much more likely not only to be psychologically distressed, but actually to develop all kinds of physiological illnesses like not only the metabolic syndrome diseases like diabetes, heart disease, strokes, but just about every single disease, including cancer diagnosis, much earlier cancer diagnosis. The research is extraordinarily powerful and very, very predictive. So what we're doing by giving support to parents in the early years, prenatally and postnatally, is actually we're saving lives later on. We're changing life trajectories in a very, very dramatic form. This isn't about touchy-feeling soft stuff. This is really hard science that's showing how important these early stages are.
So it's a very interesting question. Why is pregnancy and the early years important? If we think of life as a trajectory of development, then pregnancy is one of the most important developmental phases in our lifetime, where we move from being a child ourselves to being parents of a child, where we fulfill a biological and social drive to procreate and continue our presence for generations to come. Society needs healthy, happy, well-functioning individuals to create a collective society that can withstand the pressures of the world and our lives in the world. How we make these healthy human beings all comes down to relationships, how we interact with others. Our earliest relationships are between the very, very small, vulnerable baby and its parents. The parents create the relational environment of the baby. In fact, they create the total environment of the baby, because anything that happens to the baby is usually buffered by the parents. If we think of why parents parent in different ways, some with warmth and embracing, nurturing their babies, others with questions, perhaps ambivalence, discomfort in parenting their babies. We have to go back to the parents' own histories and what they bring with them in experiences of being babies and children themselves, what memories they bring, what body states they bring to becoming parents. There's an association in attachment research between the parents' state of mind and how they parent their babies, between their attachment patterns and the attachment patterns of their babies. Babies, tiny and totally dependent on the parents, experience their growth through bodily and emotional interactions with their parents. That's pregnancy for the parent, how they embrace their new role as procreators and nurturers of the new generation. And that's the experience of the baby, how they embraced into the world by their parents. The first 1001 days in one's life is based on these day-to-day routine interactions when parents feed, change nappies, put to sleep, and so on, whether with calmness and interest or whether with a sense of persecution, this baby's out to get me, or I'm not a good parent. These interactions, small, bodily based, visceral, smell, eye gaze, how we posture, all tell the baby about our relationship with it and what the baby evokes in us as adults. And they become embedded in the baby's body and memory, as this is how life is with other people. It's based on trust and acceptance, or perhaps it's based on mistrust and fear and a need to keep a bad world at bay, to rely on oneself, to protect oneself. It's our aim as mental health professionals to help those babies and parents where nurturing does not come easily, to adopt different patterns of interaction that can transition the parent and baby from a negative trajectory of development to something more strong and resilient. That's the aim of mental health professionals, to restore babies and their parents to a trajectory where they can expect good things out of life and where they can expect to make a contribution to their society rather than being at war